Berlin, 1968, midnight. My hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of the envelope. The stairwell reeked of dust and cigarettes, every step echoing like a gunshot. Someone was behind me. I didn't need to look. You can tell when a shadow follows too closely. I pushed through the hotel door, slammed it shut, and pressed my back against the wood. The silence was worse than the footsteps. I tore open the envelope under the yellow light. Not weapons, not cash. Something else. Something no one had warned me about. And then 3 knocks. Precise, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, counting the seconds between each one. Whoever stood on the other side already knew my name. That was the moment I stopped believing in routine operations. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Trust me, you'll want to hear the rest. The hotel in West Berlin smelled like wet carpets and cheap perfume. I'd checked in under a name that wasn't mine, wearing a suit that fit too well to belong to the man I was supposed to be. The rendezvous was set for midnight. I waited in the lounge, pretending to read a newspaper left behind by a Brit who didn't bother to fold it properly. Every time the door opened, I measured footsteps, collars, and cigarette brands. When he finally walked in, I knew. Deserters never look like heroes. He was pale, sweating through his shirt despite the cold outside. He sat across from me, slid an envelope across the table under the pretense of fixing his coat. No words exchanged, no handshake. Just the scratch of the envelope against wood. I tucked it under the newspaper and stood, leading before the waitress could ask if I wanted. Another drink got back in my room. I bolted the door and turned off the radio. I'd been trained to expect lists, maps, codes. I slit the envelope open with the dull edge of my hotel key. Inside negatives. Dozens of them, neatly cut. I held one up against the bedside lamp. Lines, grids, technical drawings. Not troop movements, not border checkpoints. It looked like blueprints, though what they depicted wasn't clear. Antennas, conduits, tunnels. I squinted, waiting for recognition to kick in, but the more I stared, the less sense it made. My first thought, wrong drop, wrong courier. But then I remembered the sweat on his neck, the fear in his eyes. Men don't risk their lives in Berlin to hand over scrap paper. I carried the envelope to the tiny bathroom, locked the door, and spread the negatives across the sink. The tiles reflected fragments of the images, warping them into something grotesque. I tried piecing them together like a puzzle no one asked for. One frame showed an arch, thick concrete walls with cables running through them. Another, a strange circular device layered with coils. My pulse was steady, but a thought kept digging in. Why me? Why not someone else with clearance? The following morning, I walked to the U-Bahn, blending into the crowd. The envelope weighed down my coat like lead. At the station, a young German kid offered me a cigarette. I refused. As the train roared in, I felt eyes on me again. That's the thing about Berlin, you're never paranoid without cause. I boarded, gripping the rail with one hand and the envelope with the other, waiting to see if anyone followed. At the next stop, no one got off behind me. At the third, a man in a gray overcoat did. Same platform, same pace. He didn't light a cigarette. He didn't check his watch. He just walked. I diverted my route, crossed through a bakery, ducked out a back door, and circled around to the hotel. Standard counter-surveillance drills. By the time I reached my room again, the man was gone, or maybe he was never there. The negatives lay spread on the sink where I'd left them. But something had shifted. One frame I hadn't noticed before was flipped over. The side facing up now showed a stamp in Russian. I didn't recall turning it. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at that single mark. A hammer and sickle watermark, faint but deliberate. Whoever prepared this envelope wanted me to see it. That should have been the end of it. Negatives, analysis, a report filed in Langley. But when I wired the summary back, the response was curt. Discard. Likely fabrication. They didn't even ask to see the originals. That told me two things. Either they already knew, or they didn't want to. Neither option sat well. I poured a drink, lit a match, and held it under the edge of the envelope. I should have burned it. Instead, I let the flame die out and slipped the negatives back inside. Something told me I'd need them again, and I did. The photographs didn't. Leave my coat pocket for 2 days. I carried them through cafes, briefings, and smoke-filled bars, waiting for Langley to change its mind. They never did. Finally, one night in my hotel bathroom, I laid them out again under the weak light. This time, I used a magnifying glass I'd borrowed from a colleague who fancied himself a stamp collector. What came into focus wasn't a border post or a weapons site. It was larger. Hidden among the grids and shadowed lines were shapes that matched industrial tunnels, access doors, ventilation shafts. And on 3 frames, antennas, big ones buried under earth, angled like they were listening to the sky. I filed an unofficial cable, phrasing it carefully, possible underground facility near Leningrad. The reply was colder than the winter. Streets, no such facility identified. Area, forested. Satellite confirms. I remember reading it twice, then pulling out an old map. The coordinates sat in a blank stretch of green, nothing but trees. Still, the negatives told another story. I pressed them against the window, Berlin lights flickering through, and saw the outlines again. Structures that shouldn't exist, and yet there they were in my hands. I arranged a quiet meeting with a contact who worked in imagery analysis. We met in a cafe where the wallpaper peeled more than the customers paid. He squinted at the negatives, then at me, then back at the negatives. "Never seen this," he muttered. "Doesn't match any of our registries." He leaned closer, lowered his voice. "You sure you want me to log this? Once it's in the system, it's not yours anymore." He slid them back across the table like they were burning his fingers. I pocketed them without a word. That night, the phone rang in my hotel room. 3 rings, a pause, then 2. No voice, just silence on the line. I waited, receiver pressed to my ear, listening to the static until it clicked dead. When I hung up, I turned to find the negatives exactly where I'd left them on the desk, except one. The frame showing the largest parabolic dish was missing. My hands went cold. I searched the floor, the drawers, even the trash. Nothing. Whoever had been in my room had taken only that dot. The next morning, I walked past the U.S. mission offices. Through the glass, I saw my supervisor laughing with 2 British officers, as if nothing in the world weighed heavier than the taste of their cigars. I didn't go in. I knew what they'd say if I asked again. Fabrication, disinformation, not our problem. I kept walking, the cold biting through my coat. The envelope thinner by 1 frame. I should have let it go. Dozens of phantoms haunted Berlin in those years, and most of them were nothing but vodka-soaked rumors. But the missing photographs stayed with me. Someone had gone to the trouble of slipping into my room, past locks and latches, just to steal. A single frame, not the whole set, just the one that mattered. And that's when I realized, maybe it wasn't about proving the facility existed. Maybe it was about making sure no one ever asked again. I first heard the name whispered in a back room above a Polish cafe, the kind of place where the coffee was strong enough to keep a man awake for 3 days, and the walls were thin enough to betray him in 2. My contact leaned forward, eyes darting to the door every few seconds, and said it like he was naming a ghost. A faceless engineer. No file photo, no birth record, not even a proper alias, just a title that carried the weight of something you weren't supposed. to ask about. He described a man who never showed his face in meetings, who spoke through intermediaries or through walls, and who oversaw experiments the Soviets never admitted existed. Not missiles, not tanks, mines. The contact swore he'd seen colleagues taken into a room with nothing but a set of headphones and leave it hours later hollow, obedient, unrecognizable. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, as if even speaking it out loud could invite retribution. Back at my hotel, I tried writing it into a report. The words looked absurd on paper. Psychological manipulation, possible weaponized influence. I stopped halfway through the sentence. At Langley, they would laugh. I could already hear the jokes. We're fighting ghosts now. So I shredded the draft, fed the strips into the toilet, and watched them dissolve into pulp. But the words stayed with me like a song you can't forget. Days later, in a smoky safe house on the western side, I pressed another informant. A Hungarian this time, a jittery man with nicotine-stained fingers who owed me more than one favor. He admitted he'd heard the same name, though never directly. They say he doesn't exist, he told me, staring into the ashtray. But orders come with his mark, always the same. He drew it on the table with the tip of a cigarette. 3 concentric circles, like ripples spreading from a stone. I recognized it instantly. It matched a faint symbol I'd seen in the corner of one of the negatives. That night, I sat awake, chain-smoking cheap German cigarettes, studying the photographs again. In the tunnels and antennas, I began to imagine him. Not his face, because apparently no one ever saw it, but his presence. The faceless engineer, orchestrating designs from behind concrete walls. I reminded myself, intelligence work isn't about imagination. It's about facts. Still, the line blurred when every fact pointed to something no one was willing to put in writing. The following week, my supervisor called me in. He tapped the folder I'd submitted, thin as it was, and smirked. You're wasting your time. The Soviets can barely feed their own people, let alone run fantasy labs. He slid the folder back to me, unopened. File it under fairy tales. Move on. I nodded, pocketed the file, and walked out. But I didn't move on, because deep down, I knew fairy tales don't leave symbols etched in blueprints. They don't echo across borders through terrified whispers. And they sure as hell don't send men into rooms alive and bring them out as shadows. That should have been the last I heard of him. But then a bookshop on Friedrichstrasse put his mark right back in my hands. The bookshop on Friedrichstrasse looked like every other on that street. Dusty shelves, crooked signs, a bell on the door that rang half a second too late. I walked in pretending to browse, hands in my pockets, scanning the faces of the 2 students arguing over poetry near the window. My contact had told me nothing more than, "There's something for you in the philosophy section." In Berlin, that could mean a pistol taped under a shelf or a death sentence folded into a pamphlet. I pulled out a worn Russian edition of Dostoevsky, pages yellowed, spine brittle. It fell open in the middle, as if trained to. A slip of paper slid out, crisp and deliberate against the fragile print. I caught it before it hit the floor. No envelope, no pretense, just Cyrillic letters scrawled in ink that hadn't yet faded. 6 words. Not fiction. Project Cascade exists. I stood there too long, pretending to read while the shopkeeper watched me over his glasses. I tucked the note back inside, bought the book with the last of my Deutschmarks, and walked out into the cold. On the tram ride back, I unfolded it again. Below the message were coordinates, written in a tighter hand, and a small symbol, 3 concentric waves radiating outward, drawn with a steady stroke. The same mark the Hungarian had traced in Ash days before. Back in my room, I laid the book on the desk and examined the coordinates. They didn't point to Berlin, or even anywhere in Germany. They landed somewhere farther east, dangerously close to Leningrad. I checked the negatives again, the tunnels, the antennas, the coils. All of it matched the implication of the note. Someone was feeding me breadcrumbs, and I was stupid enough to follow them down at night. I kept the book under my pillow, not because I thought it was safe there, but because I wanted to feel its weight. The message burned through the paper, through my skull. If this was disinformation, it was too well crafted, too precise. And if it wasn't, then I was holding a secret no one in Washington wanted to acknowledge. The next morning, I slipped into a cafe across from the checkpoint. I left the book on the table while I ordered coffee. When I came back, it was gone. Panic rose in my chest, the kind I hadn't felt since my first operation. But when I returned to my room that evening, the book was there, sitting on the desk where I hadn't left it. Same place, same angle. Someone had read it, handled it, and put it back. I poured myself a drink and sat staring at the book, the note tucked inside like a detonator, waiting for the right touch. For the first time, I wondered if the faceless engineer was less a man than a network of ghosts moving through papers, maps, symbols. And if he knew my name, then maybe the knocks at the hotel door hadn't been random. That should have been the moment I walked away. But then the radio in my room crackled with a signal I'd never heard before. The signal wasn't music, and it wasn't static either. Just a sequence pulses, gaps, pulses again. I wrote it down in my notebook that night in Berlin, convinced it was a fluke. A week later, I was on a train heading north, paper stamped under an alias that wouldn't survive a second glance. My orders didn't exist on record. Officially, I was nowhere. Crossing into Finland, the cold hit like a slap. Karelia was endless. Forests, frozen lakes, and villages where silence was currency. I carried a small receiver in my coat, tuned the same frequency. Somewhere between Joensuu and the border, the sound came alive again. Rhythmic, relentless. No voice, no code I recognized. Just a pattern that crawled under the skin. I rented a room in a wooden cabin near the edge of the forest. The landlady never asked questions. She just left matches and kerosene by the stove. Nights were long and the signal stronger in the dark. I'd sit with the receiver pressed against the table, the pulses vibrating the wood. It wasn't Morse. It wasn't numbers. It felt like someone knocking from far away, trying to teach me a language I wasn't meant to learn. One evening, I tried triangulating. I hiked through knee-deep snow, receiver crackling louder the closer I came to a ridge overlooking a frozen river. At the top, the sound peaked, sharp enough to make my teeth ache. I scanned the tree line with binoculars. Nothing but pines and shadows. Yet the signal was clear, stronger than ever. Below, I saw old fencing, rusted and bent, disappearing into the ice. A boundary to nowhere, or to something buried beneath it. Back at the cabin, I drew the coordinates on my map. They matched the note hidden in the book. Someone had led me here, and the signal confirmed it. But to what end? I poured myself a glass of cheap Finnish vodka, staring at the receiver as if it might start speaking. The pulses quickened suddenly, then slowed, as if aware I was listening. I turned the dial, hands shaking. The pattern repeated 3 times, then stopped altogether. Silence. The following morning, the landlady avoided my eyes. She muttered something about men in gray coats, asking if anyone knew I'd checked in. She swore she hadn't mentioned me, but her hands trembled as she handed me breakfast. I knew that I couldn't stay. I packed the receiver, folded the map, and slipped the note from the book into my inside pocket. On the train back toward Helsinki, the signal returned faintly, just enough to remind me it was real. I closed my eyes, the rhythm echoing in my skull, identical to what the Hungarian had traced in ash and what the negatives hinted at underground. Not fiction, not paranoia. Something was broadcasting, and it wasn't meant for the public. That should have been enough proof for Langley. But I never told them about Corellia. Some things you don't report because you're not sure if they'll erase the message or erase you. They brought him to me in a safe house on the western edge of Berlin. Thin walls, thicker curtains, 2 locks on the door that wouldn't stop anyone serious. He looked broken before he even sat down, hollow cheeks, eyes darting like a hunted animal. They called him a deserter, but he seemed more like someone who'd been left behind. I poured him a glass of water. He stared at it for 5 minutes before taking a sip, hands trembling as if the glass might explode. He started talking in fragments. Not about politics, not about ideology, about sounds. High-pitched tones that no one else could hear, drilling through his head until he obeyed without question. He said they tested it on him in a bunker outside Leningrad. At first, he resisted. Then he didn't. Orders came without words. Dreams turned into rehearsals. You wake up already knowing what they want, he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word. I asked him to describe the place. He said it smelled of paint, fresh, chemical, sharp. You ever smell fresh paint and think someone's hiding something? He asked me suddenly. I didn't answer. He described rows of chairs facing nothing, headphones with wires too thick for simple audio, men in lab coats whose faces blurred in his memory. The engineer without a face, he muttered once, and I felt the air in the room shift. I kept my notes clinical, the way Langley liked them. Subject describes auditory manipulation, possible psychotropic conditioning. But in my head, the words sounded like fiction. Still, there was something in his eyes that no report could carry pure terror. I'd seen fear before, but this was different. This was a man convinced his own thoughts weren't his dot 2 nights. Later, they found him in his room with the window open and the cobblestone 6 floors below painted dark. Officially, suicide. Unofficially, another loose end tied up. I read the report, signed my name where required, and folded the paper in 2. My jacket. But I couldn't shake his last look before we left him that night. A stare over my shoulder, as if listening to someone else in the room. I didn't tell Langley that part. Some truths don't fit into cables. They fit into nightmares. And that's when I realized the project wasn't just about building facilities. It was about building obedience, one man at a time. I flew back to Langley with the negative sealed in a diplomatic pouch, expecting resistance, but still clinging to the idea that evidence would matter. The headquarters smelled the same as always: coffee, burned down to tar, air conditioning that never matched the season, corridors lined with faces that knew too much and said too little. I filed my request, access to any documents containing the word cascade. 3 weeks later, they gave me a folder. Thin manila, stamped declassified. I opened it under fluorescent lights that hummed louder than my nerves. Every page was there, except not really. Black bars from corner to corner, whole paragraphs buried under ink. Even the signatures were redacted. You can tell a lot from what they won't let you see. And this file told me everything. Somebody was working hard to erase the trail, but whoever did the redactions missed one detail. On the margin of a memo dated 1966, just visible where the marker slipped, was a name I knew too well. My old supervisor in Berlin. A man I had taken orders from, drunk with him after shifts, trusted when trust was in short supply. Now his name was half buried, peeking out like it was daring me to ask questions. I carried the folder into the cafeteria and sat staring at it, pretending to eat. Around me, laughter, chatter, trays clattering, all noise. The file was heavier than steel. I traced the redactions with my finger, imagining the words hidden underneath. Were they experiments? Operations? Agreements? It didn't matter. The black ink was louder than any confirmation. That night in my hotel room, I spread the pages across the bed. I found myself whispering aloud the words that were missing, filling the blanks with possibilities. The faceless engineer, the antennas, the pulses in Karelia. My handwriting on the notepad looked frantic, uneven. I stopped halfway, tore it out, burned it in the ashtray. If the deserter was right, even my notes weren't safe from intrusion. The next morning, my supervisor walked past me in the corridor. Same smile, same casual nod. I wanted to grab him by the collar and demand the truth. Instead, I nodded back. File tucked under my arm like nothing had changed. That should have been the end of my questions. But the black ink only made the silence louder. Vienna was supposed to be neutral ground. A city of chandeliers, opera houses, and too many men pretending not to notice each other in hotel lobbies. I was there under the cover of a cultural exchange program, which mostly meant drinking cheap whiskey in expensive rooms while listening to academics argue about nothing. But in the evenings, real business happened in smoke-filled bars where no one asked for names. That's where I saw him. An old Hungarian operative I hadn't crossed paths with in years. He was heavier now, with a cough that sounded permanent, but his eyes still worked like searchlights. We shared a bottle, let the small talk drag. Then he leaned in close enough that I could smell the bitterness on his breath. "You're chasing casket," he said flatly. No hesitation. I didn't answer. He grinned anyway, showing teeth stained by tobacco. "It's real. Don't waste your time with satellites or reports. They'll never show you what matters." He poured another glass, hand shaking just slightly. "They're not building bombs. They're building something worse. Weapons you can't see. Weapons that don't leave rubble, just obedience." I laughed, because that's what you do when a man says something you don't want to believe. He laughed too, but it wasn't humor. His eyes went hard, like a man remembering something he'd rather forget. "You think nukes are the nightmare? At least you see the flash before you die. This you never see coming. One day you just wake up already lost." He tapped the table twice with his finger, as if sealing the thought, then changed the subject to women, food, anything but what he just said. We finished the bottle in silence. When he stood, his coat reeked of smoke and secrets. He clasped my shoulder at the door, leaned close, and muttered, "Don't follow the sound too far." Then he walked out into the night, coughing into the Vienna fog. I sat there long after he left, the words still stinging, the bottle empty. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I was chasing the truth or running straight into the trap it had set for me. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just about the Soviets. It was about us too. Berlin again. Different year, same fractured city. I was back on routine rotation at a checkpoint along the wall, the kind of assignment you take when you've run out of favors or patience. Cold mornings, endless ID checks, the shuffle of boots against concrete. Nothing dramatic until it was. One of my colleagues, a kid from Ohio with steady hands and no imagination, started slipping. At first, it was small things answering questions no one asked, staring too long at empty corners, repeating phrases under his breath like he was reciting orders. We joked about it. Too much beer, not enough sleep. But the pattern kept tightening, like a rope around his throat. On the third day, he snapped. He pulled his sidearm in the middle of the checkpoint and fired twice into the mirror we used to check under cars. Just glass and echoes. No enemy, no threat. When we wrestled the gun from him, his eyes weren't wild, they were vacant, as if he'd been somewhere else entirely, following commands none of us could hear. The report wrote itself. Stress, fatigue, unfit for duty. I signed it like everyone else. But at night, in the quiet of my flat, I couldn't stop replaying it. His lips had been moving, even as we dragged him down. I leaned close, trying to catch the words, but all I heard was the rhythm. Short bursts, long pauses. The same damn pattern I'd picked up on the receiver in Karelia. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. Berlin was full of coincidences, and most of them weren't worth dying over. But when I passed by the medical ward later, I saw him strapped to a bed, eyes open, whispering to the ceiling. His pulse steady, his voice locked on that same rhythm. And the worst part? The doctors nodded along, like they recognized it too. I filed nothing. What was I supposed to write? That the Soviets had found a way to hijack a man without touching him. Langley would have laughed me out of the building. Or worse, promoted me. So I kept my mouth shut, even as I knew silence made me complicit. Still, that night I turned on my radio, tuned to the frequency I swore I'd abandoned. The signal was there, faint but steady. I poured a drink, lit a cigarette, and listened. Each pulse felt like a nail in a coffin, though I couldn't tell if it was his or mine. That should have been the moment I walked away from the whole mess. But then I remembered whose name I'd seen half buried in those redacted files. I finally confronted him in Berlin, late autumn, leaves clogging the gutters and the wall casting longer shadows than usual. My old supervisor, his name, scrawled half visible in those redacted files, still carried himself like nothing had ever touched him. Same polished shoes, same careless grin. I asked him for a drink, and he agreed without suspicion. Men like him never believed anyone could touch them. We sat in a dim bar where the piano hadn't been tuned in years. I ordered whiskey. He ordered water. When the small talk ran dry, I dropped the word, casket. For a second, the glass paused halfway to his lips. Then he set it down, leaned back, and smiled. "You're still chasing fairy tales," I pressed. He didn't deny it, not really. Instead, he started talking about balance, cooperation, the great game. "You think the Soviets are our only enemy? Sometimes it's better to share the fire than burn alone." He said it like a joke, but his eyes gave him away. That's when I understood. The project wasn't hidden from us because it was Soviet. It was hidden because it was ours too. He told me enough to make it clear: files buried, signals ignored, reports shredded. Washington and Moscow, enemies on paper, partners in silence. He tapped his temple with one finger. "Forget bombs. Mines are cheaper." I stared at him across the table, realizing every order I'd followed under him might have been part of the same machine I thought I was fighting against. When we left the bar, he clapped me on the shoulder like an old friend. "Don't dig too deep," he said softly, almost kindly. Then he walked off into the Berlin night, blending into the fog like the city had swallowed him whole. I lit a cigarette, hands shaking, the bitter taste catching in my throat. The word casket looped in my head, heavier now, poisoned by betrayal. This wasn't about them or us. It was about something bigger, and I was already in too, far to climb out clean. And that's when I realized the real enemy wasn't on the other side of the wall. He'd been sitting across from me the whole time. I spent weeks putting it together. Every fragment, every whisper, every scrap of evidence I'd carried across borders and bars and sleepless nights. The negatives, the signal patterns, the testimonies of men already gone. I typed it out on a government-issue machine in a safe office in Berlin, page after page, careful not to editorialize. Just the facts, stripped bare. I signed my name at the bottom, sealed it in a pouch, and sent it straight to Langley through diplomatic channels. It was the cleanest dossier I'd ever written. Then I waited. 2 weeks, nothing. On the 15th day, a reply arrived. One line: "No record of such a report exists." That was it. No acknowledgement, no request for clarification. As if I'd never written it. As if the paper itself had dissolved en route. I checked with the courier who'd carried the pouch. He swore he'd logged it, handed it off properly, got the receipt. I even tracked down the file clerk in Langley, He shrugged and told me no such pouch had ever arrived. I knew he was lying. His eyes flicked to the side when I pressed him, the way men do when they've been told to stay quiet or else. That night, I broke into my own office just to be sure. I rifled through filing cabinets, checked the carbon copies. Gone. Even the ribbons I'd used in the typewriter had been replaced. They'd erased not just the report, but the act of writing it. I sat there in the dark, hands black with ink, staring at an empty drawer. All that work, all that risk, swallowed whole. And for what? To protect a project that wasn't supposed to exist? Or to protect the people who'd agreed to let it keep breathing? Back at my flat, I poured a drink and stared at the last page I'd kept hidden, a single sheet with the word Cascade underlined twice. I'd meant to include it in the pouch, but something told me to hold it back. Maybe paranoia, maybe instinct. Either way, it was the only proof left that the report had ever lived. I folded it, slipped it inside a novel on my shelf, and sat in silence. Outside, Berlin buzzed with the sound of trams and laughter and secrets. Inside, I felt the weight of something heavier than betrayal. The realization that I was fighting not just the Soviets, but the erasure of truth itself. And that's when I knew the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the void that swallowed it. Decades later, long after Berlin was no longer split, and my knees reminded me of every cold morning I ever spent on patrol, the sound came back. I woke in the middle of the night, sweat soaking through the sheets, the house silent except for it, that hum. Low, steady, the same rhythm I'd scribbled in notebooks and heard in headphones. The same pulse the deserter had sworn was inside his skull. I sat up, heart thudding slower than the sound itself, and for a moment, I thought it was just memory. But it didn't fade. I walked to the kitchen, glass of water shaking in my hand, staring at the radio on the counter. It wasn't plugged in, hadn't been for years. Still, the hum was there, crawling under the silence, vibrating through the pipes. I pressed my palms against my ears. It stayed. I thought of the negatives, of the note in the book, of the kid from Ohio pulling the trigger at Shadows. I thought of my supervisor's smile in that Vienna bar, the Hungarian's cough, the memo with his name half scratched out. None of it ever went away. Neither did Casket. I stood there in the dark, listening, unsure if it was in the walls or in me. Maybe both. I never kept souvenirs, but sometimes the past keeps you. These days, I sit in a quiet house where the curtains don't move unless I touch them. And yet, I still expect to find notes slipped inside old books or photographs turned over on the desk. Most nights are calm. Some aren't. The hum comes back not loud, not constant, just enough to remind me that silence was always the real lie. I've told you everything I could, more than I should, and less than what was erased. Don't ask me for proof. Proof doesn't survive. Men like me barely do. All I know is the project had a name, and names don't disappear. They echo. If you've listened this far, you already carry a piece of it with you. Maybe that was the point all along. If you want more of these stories, give this a like, subscribe,